The North is going to be rich in natural resources. That's why they're going to become major shipbuilders. In addition, of course, they're right on the water, so you're going to find fishing, shipbuilding, major exports back to Mama Britain as part of mercantilism. And, of course, they're going to be involved in fishing and whaling. And if we know anything about sort of the byproducts of whales, that's going to be important for a while, okay? Now, Northern colonial economics that we want to pay attention to, sort of in terms of the small towns that we see, we're going to see plenty of small businesses. People are going to be making rum, clothes are going to be made, small ironworks, okay? And they're going to be the heart of trading with England out of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. But that all leads us to sort of the main point that I want you to understand, of course, is the triangular trade. Hopefully you guys remember this. The triangle trade is going to send goods to Europe. It's not truly a triangle. From Europe to Africa, from Africa down to the West Indies, and then back up to New England. So even though it's a triangular trade, it actually has 4 sides, but we're sending raw materials over there, and in some ways it's going to come back in either finished goods or it's going to come back in slaves. Okay? Now, very crucial in the South. It really is 2 products. If you get a colonial question, do not mention cotton. Cotton is not part of the game until... what happens? No, not 1850s. Actually, 1803 is going to be our cotton gin. But the important part is, Eli Whitney on the scene in the 1790s, you're going to get cotton shifting late 1700s, early 1800s. It's really tobacco, and as you go further south, it's going to be indigo. And as our small farms turn into plantations, we're obviously going to need major labor sources, and just as I told you before, indentured servants, and then we got Bacon's Rebellion, then we're going to be dealing with slaves. But for the most part, you don't have huge plantations. And I think that's a major misnomer that we have, is that all of a sudden the South is full of these gone-with-the-wind plantations. It's not. For the most part, it's small farmers who may have a few slaves, but generally speaking, most people didn't have slaves overall. Okay? Now, African slave trade, most slaves didn't come directly to the New World. They actually went to South America or the Caribbean. And it's an important question. You know, what's the origins of this slavery? It starts as perhaps like indentured servitude, but there's some real benefits to African slaves over whites. And in part, resistance to malaria in terms of working in certain really, really difficult conditions like growing rice. Holding slaves costs less than indentured servants because, I hate to say this, but you could treat them worse without really a consequence necessarily. And there was an understanding that they weren't ever going to necessarily have their freedom. Plus, and this is really what separated the United States or sort of America, the New World, from other places that had slaves, our slaves begat the next generation of slaves, who begat the next generation of slaves. So our slavery actually grows through natural reproduction. But it's not to say that we didn't have resistance. And believe it or not, the AP loves the Stono Rebellion for some reason. Okay? In part because it's one of those rebellions that happens in the 18th century. For the most part, we're going to see them happen in the 19th century with guys like Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey and even Gabriel Prosser, probably one you don't remember. But the Stono Rebellion is one of the first, and again, a bunch of slaves get together and they try to resist, and as always is the case, someone rats them out and it doesn't really work out, and then those slaves that were involved are usually executed. But the Stono Rebellion is sort of the first of the rebellions, okay? Now, I'm going to switch gears a little bit to the Great Awakening. I'm sure that unless you are a terribly sort of detailed student of history, you don't remember your first Great Awakening from your second Great Awakening. And you probably, before I told you, couldn't tell me when each Great Awakening happened. But they generally are about 100 years apart. The first one is 1730s and 1740s. And it's important to realize that the European Enlightenment made people start to think, wait a sec, maybe these religious explanations don't really cut it. So as a result, you've got people that are becoming more secular in their thinking. And our Puritans, they don't like anybody to question them. Remember Anne Hutchinson, remember Roger Williams, okay? So they're looking for new ways to bring people back to the church. And one of the ways, and I don't think I have it up here, is the halfway covenant, which is one of your terms over the summer. I'm sure you guys remember fondly. But this idea that we're going to admit people to the church without baptism. It's sort of a way to loosen the restrictions and get more people involved. Okay? Now, Jonathan Edwards is the single name that you need to remember from the First Great Awakening. Very, very famous preacher whose speech or sermon that he gave over and over again was sinners in the hands of an angry God. It really was, you need to come back to the church. This is the only way. It was a really sort of fire and brimstone story of sort of damnation that was coming out. Now, the other name, if you had to come up with a second name, is George Whitefield, a cross-eyed British preacher whose cross eyes actually were important in that anybody who lampooned him always drew him sort of looking silly with his cross eyes, but really known for having this great oratory skill, so much so that Ben Franklin, who was a deist, a guy who didn't even believe truly sort of in your Holy Trinity at all, believed in a clockmaker universe, he said, listen, I mean, I was moved by George Whitefield. Okay? The results are important. It leads to church membership increase. And you're going to see two main religions pop up. And I had a student last year who came up with this. So all of you who are friends of Breaking, or fans of Breaking Bad, hopefully you can remember this, okay? It's called Breaking Baptist because they made Methodist, okay? So if you know anything about Breaking Bad, so you really have the Methodists and the Baptists, which later on in the Second Great Awakening are really going to sort of move importantly into the South. You also are going to have this first major movement in the colonies. When I talk about necessary preconditions, the Great Awakening and colonies coming together is one of the first necessary preconditions for a revolution. You need to have people coming together to start to talk, to start to commune in a way that you're going to build that community, because obviously someone from Virginia is very different than somebody from, let's say, New England, and somebody from Pennsylvania is different than somebody from Georgia. So coming together is important. And lastly, it created Dartmouth College, which rejected me for early admission in November 1995, and I'm not bitter anymore. I may have sounded bitter when I first told you guys about it in September, but I'm not bitter anymore at all, okay? So, you've got colleges that are created. So we'll move on from Dartmouth. All right, now, we got to get to the French and Indian War, because if you are going to come to the next review on Wednesday morning with Miss Barrett, you're going to be jumping off right at 1763. So you got to figure out, why is 1763 important? It's important because that is the major change in the relationship between Mama Britain and the colonies. Now, it's got a terrible name, the French and Indian War. That means not that the French fought the Indians, that means that we fought the French and the Indians. And we aren't terribly part of it. It's really the French and the Indian versus the British and Iroquois War. Now you say, wait a second, Panderson, Indians and Iroquois. Well, aren't Iroquois Indians? Yes, they are. But it just so happened that the Iroquois were the only Indians who didn't join the French. So it's quite complicated. The French and Indian versus the British and Iroquois War that is sometimes known as the 7 Years' War, despite the fact that it lasted 9 years. So you've got a bunch of sort of nomenclature that is not that accurate, okay? It's part of a bigger war that is going on, and a continuation of the war for Jenkins' Ear and the Queen Anne's War, all this fun stuff that you may or may not remember from Euro, okay? But it's important to realize that the Iroquois are so powerful that they're almost on par with your French and your British. And in this particular case, the Iroquois are going to join with the British because they think they can get the best deal, because they're all fighting over the Ohio River Valley, particularly this area where the French are going to build Fort Duquesne. And yes, I know that that word doesn't look like Duquesne, but it is. Now, you're going to remember, at least if you're in my class, that you've got Fort Duquesne, which is a rather formidable fort, and George Washington, sort of a member of the Virginia militia, goes out and builds Fort Necessity. Again, my son builds pillow forts on our couch that are more impressive than Fort Necessity. And it was quickly overrun. It's a very ignominious beginning for the man who's going to later become our first president. But George Washington is representing the British with the Iroquois against the French and all the other Indians. And the way that it plays out is that at the end of the day, the British are going to win. But I'd be remiss if I skipped something called the Albany Plan. And the reason I want to bring up the Albany Plan is, one, because I have a man crush on Benjamin Franklin, and two, because I want you to understand that there are 4 times that the colonists get together, and it's going to build from the first time when not all the colonies send representatives, all the way through the Continental Congresses. So this is Ben Franklin's early idea to bring all of the colonies essentially together in this funky system where basically they'd come together almost in a confederation. They would keep their own constitutions, but there'd be sort of a grand council. And at the end of the day, the British didn't like it because they felt they'd be giving up too much power. And most colonies didn't want it because they felt that they wanted to have their own independence. So the reason I bring it up is the next time they're going to get together is the Stamp Act Congress. The next time they get together, First Continental, and then Second Continental. So I like to think of it as 4 times where they're growing in strength and growing in unity. Now, the Albany Plan comes about in this particular era right before we're going to get sort of the heart of the French and Indian War. So I bring this up because the British officers treat the colonists in a way that the colonists hadn't been treated. Remember, because of this very important term, salutary neglect, going all the way back, this hands-off treatment of the colonists had grown to believe, listen, we're on our own. And all of a sudden during this war, they're being impressed, which of course we complain that the British and the French are going to do to us later on. They're forcing colonists into the army. They're basically taking supplies, saying what's yours is ours. And then they're putting soldiers in their homes. Now, of course, we're going to complain about this later on. We've got an amendment to our Constitution that forever forbids this after the Revolution. We're seeing the early genesis of perhaps some of these complaints that we're going to see in the Revolution. You could see this on the AP. We're losing, and by we, of course, I mean the Americans, the American colonists, the Iroquois, and the British, until the Battle of Quebec. And the Battle of Quebec is sometimes called the battle that saved America. Because had we not won in Quebec under the new leadership of a man named the great organizer William Pitt, perhaps we'd still be speaking French today. Sacre bleu? I don't know. Sort of the appropriate term. Now, the British are going to win, and the French are going to be gone. Now, this is important, because when the French are gone, what's their goal? Once they're gone, what are the French thinking? Yes?
Get back at Britain.
Got to get back, okay? And that's going to be important in the Revolution when, of course, after Saratoga, you have the Franco-American alliance. So remember, when Britain and France and the colonies are together, they're never all on board with each other unless it's World War I or World War II. They're always at the beginning sort of hopping in and out of bed with each other, okay? So we're with the British against the French, and then we're going to be with the French against the British, and then we're going to be against the British and the French, and as we lead into War of 1812. So remember, it's sort of that love triangle going on. Now, the Treaty of Paris is going to end this 7 years war that's really 9 years. Britain's going to gain land all the way to the Mississippi. But what's important is they don't let the colonists go all the way to the Mississippi. Where are they stopped? Yes? The Appalachians. Very, very important as a proclamation of 1763 proclamation line. That's going to be major resentment because the colonists say, listen, why can't we go past that point? And then later, in the lead up to the Revolution, you're going to have actually something called the Quebec Act, which allows the French to be there, and it's problematic, okay? So, the effects of this war, okay? Because of the proclamation line, the British are going to keep the colonists penned in between the Appalachians and the coast. They say it's for their own good. They say it's protecting them from Native Americans. But more than anything, what they want is they don't want the colonists going west. Because if the colonists go west, they've lost their best trading partner. So they want them cooped up on the East Coast, okay? Now, I'm sorry, this is very, very difficult to read. But what's interesting is the Iroquois are technically on the winning side. So you think they'd reap the benefits. But the British say, we don't believe that you helped us when we really needed it. So despite the fact you were our ally and you're on the winning side, we basically aren't giving you anything. And that really is considered the end of the Iroquois power. Prior to this, the Iroquois were, as I said, on par with these great European countries like Britain and France. You're going to see, essentially, that the Brits are going to change their policy as of 1763. We fought this war for you, and as a result, we expect that you will help us repay the debts from this war, which will lead to taxes such as sugar starting, and then we're going to have, quartering is different, stamp, and we're going to find our way all the way to, common sense with Thomas Paine. Okay? That, my friends, is the end thus far, okay, of our lectures. And I apologize it took so long. And again, apologies that I wasn't right in front of the screen the whole time.